Hey everyone, here's another webinar on forensic psychology, and today we're going to be focusing on Eysenck's criminal personality theory. We look at this area because it falls under the specification in terms of the explanations as to why people offend, and this is just one of many that you need to know for the option in paper 3 AQA psychology. Now, one thing that I get my students to do is I get them to take Eysenck's personality test, and we actually have a condensed version that we use, and we answer some questions on those. So I encourage you, just maybe perhaps before you continue with the webinar, see if you can find one online. If I find one, I'll put it in the description box, and have a go at determining your amounts of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. We're going to come to know what those terms actually mean later on in the webinar. In terms of our lesson goals, so we want to make sure that we are able to outline key features of Eysenck's personality dimensions and the role of extroversion and neuroticism in offending. We also want to be able to outline research into the relationship between personality and criminality. We want to explain methodological limitations of research into the relationship between personality and criminality. And finally, we want to be able to evaluate personality factors in explaining criminality. And we're going to do that towards the end, where we'll create several peel paragraphs so that you can have them in your bank of AO3 for forensic psychology. Now, this is Mr. Eysenck on your screens right now, and he says, I developed the Eysenck Personality Inventory, a form of psychological test which locates respondents along the extroversion and neuroticism dimensions to determine their personality type. And I'm just going to pause there because we come across quite a few new words, words that you may not have recognized before or understand what they mean in context. So we'll start off firstly with inventory. In psychology, inventory is just another word that we use to describe a self-report measure, which is often recognized as a questionnaire. We also have the word dimension, and by dimension we are just simply saying that the traits that Eysenck is interested in, they are on a continuum, and they have a starting point and not so much an ending point, but just the opposite of the trait itself. So for example, we know that the opposite of extroversion is introversion. The opposite of neuroticism is stability. So we have these dimensions that people can be at any point along, if that makes sense. Just to continue, it says, I believe that personality has a biological basis. Extroverts, for example, have an underactive nervous system, which means that they constantly seek enjoyment through risk-taking behaviors. So that's Eysenck, and that's in a nutshell what he's all about. So how did he obtain his data? Well, what he did is that he, along with his wife, assessed 2,070 male prisoners who were compared to a control group of 2,422 males. On measures of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism, prisoners recorded higher scores than the control group, which is congruent with the prediction of the theory. Now, just to deconstruct that a little bit, the fact that he's only looked at male prisoners suggests that his research is a word beginning with A, and it's androcentric. And by androcentric is a type of gender bias whereby we are only focusing on one particular gender, and oftentimes we use that piece of research to try and explain the opposing gender being females. Now, this is a reach for Eysenck because we know that men and women differ on many things, including personality. So we've got a question mark there already in terms of an AO3 point later on down the line. But nonetheless, his research has shown that actually those who were in prison scored higher on certain traits which have been linked to criminality. And it might explain why they were in prison in the first place. Eysenck proposed that there are personality traits which have a genetic basis, and that is simply to say that personality is rooted in our biology. He went on a little bit more broadly to say, well, hormones contribute to the formation of personality, and different neural relationships in our brain contribute to the development of our personality. He obviously came up with the first two personality traits being extroversion and neuroticism, and later on he added psychoticism, which is an additional trait that we understand to be influenced by testosterone levels. As we go into each of the personality traits that Eysenck proposes as linked to criminality, it's important that we understand what qualities are often associated with each trait. So we'll start off with extroversion. Extroverts are often known as being outgoing, happy, optimistic, positive, but they tend to get bored easily. Neurotics are often known as being highly emotional, quite soft. They have a negative outlook on life, are often pessimistic, and they're associated with depression, anxiety, and anger. And finally, psychotics are often regarded as being egocentric and aggressive. And just to hone in on that word egocentric, that is to be focused solely on yourself, your own needs, above the needs of other people. Now, in terms of how each of these personality traits can be linked to criminal behavior, well, we can just have a look at that and try and make some links now. And it's good that even in your AO1, you start to show whoever's reading your paper, your script, that you are able to make links between personality traits and offending behavior. Try not to dwell on the neutral understanding that you have of each trait. Make sure you are linking it to offending behavior. So we can see here, well, if extroverts are those individuals who get bored easily, it could be that they engage in risk-taking behavior in order to alleviate the feeling of boredom. If neurotics are often pessimistic and negatively minded, then it could be that they interpret situations as being negative and they wrongly respond to them. And sometimes that response can be a criminal one. So it could be that they see someone walking down the street, the person it appears to them that they're pulling a face at them, and they respond in a way that is aggressive and leads into the fact that they've committed an offense of grievous bodily harm. And then finally, for psychotics, rather, we have egocentrism. So the fact that they are considered to be egocentric people could explain some of the crimes of passion that we see. Sexual offenders as well are often egocentric because they seek to gratify their own needs above the needs of another person. So that can really explain criminal behavior. So just in that moment, we've linked each personality trait to a criminal behavior. Then you can see that we have Eysenck's personality dimension, and most textbooks would have his dimension as shown on the screen now. And what I want to point out to you guys is that you can see that they are indeed on a dimension. And all that means is that you can find yourself anywhere on that circle. Now, in this circle, we only have the traits neuroticism and extroversion, and obviously their opposing parts on the diagram, and he later on added on psychoticism. But it could be that we find ourselves in any quadrant depending on the mix of traits that we have. So someone can be considered an unstable extrovert and they will find themselves in that top right quadrant. Someone can be considered a stable introvert and they find themselves in the lower left quadrant as well. And you can see some of the traits that are associated with individuals who have moderately high to low scores on either dimension. So perhaps if you've completed the questionnaire that I told you to complete in the first slide, then you might have got a result saying that you are a high extrovert with moderate levels of stability, and you would be able to locate where you would be placed on this particular diagram. So have a go at doing that in your own time. Now, Eysenck says that every single personality trait has a biological basis, and we're just going to go over the biological basis for extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Extroversion is determined by the arousal in a person's nervous system, and it's argued that extroverts are innately under-aroused, so they would seek stimulation. For example, they will take risks and they will engage in dangerous behaviors. Introverts, on the other hand, are innately over-aroused, and so they seek to reduce or avoid stimulation. Neuroticism as a personality trait is determined by the stability in a person's sympathetic nervous system. And we know that the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for our fight or flight response, and that is our body's response to threatening situations. Now, neurotic or unstable people have an overactive sympathetic nervous system, and so they react and get upset very quickly, even when the stimuli doesn't call for a response such as fighting or fleeing that situation. What that means is that in terms of criminality, it means that they are interpreting non-threatening situations as threatening situations, and that could possibly explain why they fall into committing criminal offences. On the other hand, stable people have an unreactive nervous system and are able to remain calm under pressure. And of course, we know that our body is able to override that calmness in real threatening situations, but that's only the case in stable people. Finally, psychoticism is determined by testosterone levels, and testosterone is a hormone in the human body. Both men and women have testosterone. However, because testosterone is found in the Y chromosome, it is predominantly a male hormone. So high levels of testosterone are positively correlated with psychotic personalities, which means that men are more likely to fall under the psychotic personality trait than women. And it may explain some of the statistics that you would have uncovered if you looked at the ways of measuring crime. Some of the statistics that indicate that men seem to be doing the most when it comes to criminal activity in comparison to women. Testosterone, the cause of crime. So now we're on to our AO3 points, and I've structured this in a point, evidence, explanation, and however format. So our point will be, there is statistical evidence to suggest that testosterone levels are heavily linked to criminal behavior. Our evidence. Testosterone is much higher in men as it is found on the Y chromosome. This explains why statistics have revealed that men murder at 10 times the rate of women, which is attributed to the high levels of testosterone found in men. Our counter-argument, however, it is biologically deterministic to say that testosterone causes criminal behavior, as we cannot explain the non-criminal behavior of those with high levels of testosterone. This suggests that there is an aspect of free will to be considered in explaining criminal behavior. And I want you to notice what I did there. When I was talking about the counter-argument, I ensured that where I mentioned determinism, I've also mentioned free will. And what I like to call that is versus. You can't mention one issue in debate and not consider the other. That's leaving your AO3 point half-baked, half-done, and it's rude. It's very, very important that you guys get into the habit of, if you mention one side of an issue in debate, you must consider the other side to make sure that your AO3 point is wholesome. So let's have a look at another AO3 point. Support and research for the genetic basis of personality. Our point is there is positive research support for the genetic basis for personality, which supports Eysenck's theory. The evidence comes from twin studies done by Zuckerman, and he looked at correlations between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. He found that both monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins were positively correlated for the traits neuroticism and extroversion. And as you can see there, there's a breakdown of the actual correlation coefficient. So I'm just going to pull out one of them so that we can fully understand what it means. So have a look at where it says plus 0.52 correlation. This was specifically for monozygotic twins on the trait neuroticism. Plus 0.52 simply means that there was a 52% chance that if one twin had the trait of neuroticism, the other twin would get it. We have a look at the similar thing for extroversion, plus 0.51 for the trait extroversion for monozygotic twins. Now we know that monozygotic twins share 100% of the same genes. So if we're truly saying that it has a biological and genetic basis, we would expect the correlation coefficient to be near enough to 1. 1 would indicate that indeed it is genetically determined, if that makes sense. But in this case, it's only 0.52, and it suggests that there must be another contributing factor as to why these twins perhaps share neuroticism as a trait or do not share neuroticism as a trait. Could it be that the environment plays a part in it? And then we have our counter arguments. Now, there are a lot of counter arguments. I'm only going to hone in on the second and third one. In fact, the first and third one, simply because you guys can read it in your own time and you can expand on it for yourself. So the first counter arguments, however, results show that there is around 40% of the variance in these traits is due to genes and 60% to other factors. So that just expands on what we shared earlier. Other factors could be environmental. It could be the fact that twins share the same environment, so we can't really tease apart the influence of genetics versus the influence of the environment. And the third counter argument there is, furthermore, the evidence does not explain criminal behavior, as Eysenck's criminal personality theory was not created for the purposes of explaining criminal behavior. In fact, I've just said Eysenck's criminal personality theory, but it's actually Eysenck's personality theory. It's not a criminal personality theory. It was never intended to be used as a criminal personality theory. And this in itself raises several issues, because it could be that we are using a tool to try and profile criminals that wasn't really created to profile criminals. And there we have an issue of, a validity issue. How valid is our measure of personality in indicating whether someone's going to commit a crime or not? How strong is the predictive validity of Eysenck's personality questionnaire in determining whether someone is a criminal or not? So I've really gone into something quite deep there, and we're going to move on very quickly. Now, there's a few AO3 points that will come up on the screen, and you guys can pause and have a go at actually writing out your own evidence, your own conclusion, your counter argument for each of these points. So the first one here is personality situational. By situational, we are saying personality is affected by our environment. So the point here, Eysenck's criminal personality assumes that personality is consistent. The evidence is definitely going to be that we know personality changes from time to time. The counter argument would suggest that actually there are certain situations, regardless of the situation, we respond in the same way, and that would suggest that there's a degree of consistency in terms of how we behave. Another AO3 point for you to perhaps pause and have a go at writing, but I'm going to talk through it. Personality tests may not be reliable. So the point is, Eysenck developed the Eysenck's personality questionnaire to measure personality. This self-report method has a number of limitations. Number of limitations including the fact that people lie. People will lie about themselves. That's more to do with social desirability bias and the desire to present ourselves in a positive light. Another issue could be the use of Likert scales. So if a scale simply goes from 1 to 7, well, the middle number there will become a dumping ground for people who don't want to tend towards the extremes. In situations like that, it's better to have a Likert scale that goes from 1 to 6, where there is no middle ground, and you kind of force people to tend towards either end of an extreme. On the other hand, we can say a questionnaire is a really useful method. It's quick, it's efficient, and in some cases, there is some evidence to suggest that people tend to be slightly more honest on questionnaires as opposed to interviews. Another point to make regarding questionnaires is the fact that it is empirical. It draws upon empirical evidence. It can produce quantitative data, and that will contribute to our whole understanding of psychology as a science. Finally, questionnaires are highly replicable. So you can tell me what questionnaire you gave out to your peers, and if I can find that same questionnaire, give them out to my own peers, there is a degree of replicability there. It's important that we stretch our AO3, and this is the last slide. Stretch your AO3 by considering the following. So think about psychology and the economy. How is it beneficial to know the personality type of criminals? How might that help the economy? And it could be, well, if we are better able to identify those who are at risk of offending just based on their personality, it could be that we have some early intervention methods to prevent them from actually going on to commit a crime, and that will save the taxpayers money in terms of, funding those who don't really need to be going to prison if we can step in slightly earlier. Real world application. So again, like I mentioned, if we can identify those who may be at risk of offending just simply based on their personality, then that might be helpful. However, there could be an issue of labeling. So if we label all extroverts as being under aroused and being thrill seekers and being people who are likely to turn to a life of crime, then there's an issue, because I know for a fact that I'm considered an extrovert in certain situations, and I would rather not have someone say to me, oh yeah, you're more likely to commit a crime. So there's an issue of labeling there, and we might talk about social sensitivity. I mentioned earlier about psychology as a science, so we would love to say that Eysenck's criminal personality embraces psychology as a science because it uses empirical, replicable methods. Arguably, the methods aren't objective because it's relying on the subjective interpretation of the individual's understanding of their personality, and that has its drawbacks. It might be better to get someone else to rate the participant's personality, if I can say that. And finally, issues and debates. So we touched on determinism versus free will. We briefly touched on nature versus nurture. And these are things that you could bring in if you know that you're struggling in terms of your AO3. Consider these 4 areas: psychology and the economy, real world application, psychology as a science, and issues and debates. Right, I hope you guys have enjoyed this webinar. I hope it's been useful, and I wish you all the best with your studies. Please let me know if there's any particular videos that you want me to do, and I will try my best to get those done for you. God bless.